everybody, it's Margo here and Birdie.
Hello.
Here at My Favorite Quilt Store, and we are here getting ready to talk about binding and putting a binding on a quilt. And this is my first quilt class, so we're trying to teach you how to do a binding and finish a quilt so that you can give it away or you can hang it up or you can enjoy it, because the binding is the very last part.
I always say your first quilt you should keep because it's a great thing to have years later after you've been quilting 10, 15, 25 years, and you can compare how much you've progressed, because most people's first quilt is not perfect.
Or first quilt class.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Because in the quilt class you're just trying to learn the techniques and that kind of stuff. And so you're really honing your techniques.
Right.
I feel like when I'm taking a class I'm trying to hone a technique versus
I agree.
Actually and mastering a technique versus doing something. And I have my first quilt. You want to bring it to me? That I did. This was my first quilt class. I'd had made 2 or 3 quilts ahead of this and realized what I didn't know. Mine has been used because it has
stains
on it.
But this is how you want your quilts to look, because you know that people use them, they love them.
And it's been faded a little bit by the sun. But it sat on my kitchen table for a number of years as a center square, so that everyone, when they first walked in, could see this beautiful quilt.
And she's got 1, 2, 3 borders, which we only did 2. So.
We only did 2 borders.
Yeah, and it looks like this was hand appliqued, right?
And it was. So you had your choice of hand applique or machine applique.
Right.
This 25 years ago, they made me hand applique. There was no machine applique back then.
They made me do that too.
So, because Paula took the same class, but at a different time from the same instructor I had taken the class from. So, I came up with this quilt because it basically teaches you all the same techniques, but it and helps you hone in on some that you'll need for any quilt class or any quilt that you think about making.
Right.
Most of them have borders. A 4 patch is like a very basic patch showing applique, and then half square triangles. You could make any one of these elements into a whole quilt.
Yeah.
Or utilize them in different ways to make other quilts with these particular skills that you're going to learn, because you could turn a 4 patch into a 9 patch or into a 16 patch depending upon what you wanted to do. Bindings, in our directions we tell you to cut a 2.5 inch binding, and that is a very standard width for quilting, and most beginners start with 2.5 inch binding. One of the things that we were talking about is that as you get more advanced, we cut our binding at different sizes.
I cut mine at 2 1/4.
And I normally would cut mine at 2 1/4. And you'll find that as you progress and as you move along, you'll find
you might want to do that as well. Not everybody does, but most people do. But
right.
You're the master of your craft. You can do it whatever way you want.
Whatever you want to. So I find that when I do 2.5, I've got a little more binding on the back than the front, because when you pull it back after the 1/4 inch seam,
when you wrap it around, your goal is to have the front look like the back. And I'm better at that when I cut a 2 1/4 rather than a 2.5 inch.
And I am too. And a lot of times, if you're going to put your quilt in a competition, they want to make sure that your binding is very stuffed with the it has batting and backing in it, and it feels plump. And so that's why the 2 1/4 is really the right. If you're going to put your quilt in a competition, that's the size of binding that you would want, or it may be skinnier depending upon how you decide you're going to bind your quilt. So we're showing you a regular binding that's a 2.5 inch binding that we'll be putting on the quilt. How to cut it, sew it together, and then affix it to the quilt. We will be using a couple different fabrics in this because we're in different processes and different stages of each of the different quilts. So you'll notice that we might we'll be cutting the binding for this quilt, and yet we'll be putting binding on the blue quilt. So we're in different stages of different quilting processes along.
Just because we had to get all the videos in, and we had more than one person doing the videos.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. People say that the binding is their least favorite thing, and they try and either rush through it or just keep putting it off. But for me, it's the last step, and I love handwork. There's a lot of quilters out there that are not messing with the hand quilt anymore. They're putting them on by machine.
Right.
But, you know, there's always more than one way to do things, and I like the look of a hand-bound quilt. You sew it on, you know, with the machine, but then when you flip it over on the back side, I do that all by hand. Some people don't like that, but I'm gonna walk you through it, so maybe you'll love it as much as I do.
And I personally like to put it on by hand also. I don't always have the time to. I definitely think that when I've tried doing it by machine, I haven't on the backside too. I have not had the success that I like to achieve for my quilt, for the look that I want of my quilts.
Even after all the videos I've watched, I still feel that I don't get it the way, I don't like the look when it's completely done. So
that's
a work in progress for me.
That's right,
yeah.
And that's you know, and we may change over time.
Exactly.
But it's where we're at right now, and you could be at a different place and decide that you can figure out how to do the machine, all by machine, and you love it, and that's
But as
fabulous.
a beginner, we're going to teach you how to do it
by
the
hand.
old-fashioned way.
Right, by hand.
By hand.
So we're going to sew it on with the machine first, flip it over to the back side. You sew it on the front of the quilt, you flip it to the back side, and then you hand stitch the binding down.
All the way around your quilt.
All the way around the quilt. And you know, it's kind of something that's nice to do when you're watching TV.
Exactly.
That's what I do it when I'm watching TV. It's when I find that I can hand sew the best.
Some people can take them in the car where they're going on a trip, and they can actually do handwork in the car. I'm not one of them.
But I'm not one of them.
People
that
do
can
that.
Do it in the
so
car
it's something, you know, you have many options on putting when you put your binding on.
Yep.
But just take your time and don't rush. It's the last thing you're going to do on the quilt.
And Birdie's going to show you how to finish the binding, and her way is one of the ways to finish a binding. There's many different ways to finish a binding, but we're going to show you what she has found that has worked. I might have just slightly different process. You've got to really find what works for you.
Exactly.
And probably about the third or fourth binding you put on, it's going to click really well for you.
Yeah.
But it takes a little bit of time, so don't be upset if you can't master it.
No, but when you get it done and you see how it's all, because it finishes your quilt off. And
it's very beautiful.
Yes, it can be.
So, all right, well, let's get started on cutting that binding and figuring out how to move forward, okay?
Now we're going to go ahead and start cutting our binding. And per the instructions on this quilt, it tells us that we need to cut 5 strips at 2.5 inches. So we've got to square off this raw edge here just to make sure that okay, so we know we've got a good edge there. You can do this 2 ways. You could take this piece of fabric and flip it over and just use this ruler. I like to leave it the way it is. It's, again, your preference, but I've got my other little ruler here, and we're going to cut it at 2.5. So I'm going to put this at the 2.5 edge, and then I can butt this against it and cut my strip. And I think I need to pull it a little bit closer to me. Let's do that again. Again, on the 2.5 inch mark on my ruler. Okay. Okay. And the other thing that I like to do every time you cut, you know, it's never perfect. So I always look at my ruler and I can already tell that I'm off a tiny bit with this straight edge. So I'm going to square up again. And that's not because, you know, you do anything wrong. It's the way the fabric is folded and how it comes off the bolt sometimes. It's not perfect. Okay, so I got that one. So now we can keep going. And like I said, this one tells us that we're going to cut 5 strips. Okay, so we've got our 5 strips cut for our binding, so now we're ready to go to the sewing machine, and I'm going to show you how to sew the binding pieces together.
With the phone, it doesn't really affect it. So, ready whenever.
Okay, so when you're making a binding and you sew your strips together, you don't sew them with the straight edges together. You do it on the bias. So I'm going to show you what I'm doing here. I'm just matching it up. You want to make sure I want to get up close on this. There's little tiny dots on the salvaged edge. You don't want to use any of that, and if you have to use it, make sure it remains within your seam allowance. So, but we know we have enough, so I'm going to line this up. And again, you can't see it, but there's little tiny dots here, so I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to use any of those. So try and get it as straight as possible, and then I like to pin. If you watch more of my videos, you'll realize that I pin just about everything. That's the way I was taught, and I feel like I get better accuracy. Okay, so now that we've got it on there, you're going to sew a diagonal line. And I've been quilting so long that I don't have to mark it, but I did notice that even me with all my years, I get better accuracy, because you want to go where these 2 fabrics meet here and these 2 fabrics meet there, and get one of your marking tools. This is a light blue that I'm using. And I don't know how well it shows up, but I can see my line, and that's what I'm going to sew on. So we're going to do all of them, so you can either, I like to do one at a time and then come back. I mean, go ahead and pin them all at the same time. Right sides together. Yeah, don't forget, you always got to go right sides together. I should have told you that. And again, I pin it first. And the reason you do a diagonal instead of a straight stitch is it just makes it easier. You don't, and I press my seams open, so it just looks nicer, and plus it's the way I was taught. The only time I'll do it where I sew like edge to edge like this is if I'm working with a plaid or a stripe and I want to make that continuous. You can figure out how it goes and you can piece it. Otherwise, I always do it on the bias. It's just easier on the eye when you're looking, especially even when I'm piecing my borders sometimes. If I have to piece my borders and stuff when you're making a larger quilt, depending on how wide that border is, I'm going to piece my border on the diagonal. It's just easier on the eye than like a straight line. Okay, so I'm going to line my needle up right with that line that I drew on there, and that's what I'm going to follow. And okay. The reason I use this to start and stop, I don't know if anybody's told you that. It's like a nice little tip. Some older machines, when you start sewing at the beginning of your fabric, your, put my needle up and my foot up. Sometimes people say that their fabric gets all bunched up in one of these holes here or whatever. So I just use this, and it's like every time I make a binding, I save the excess binding pieces. And I just start on this, and I let it go a little bit, because you can see when I've done this, I've got this little tail and it's all twisted together. So when I trim these, my seam's not going to start to come undone. You don't want to ever trim right at the edge, because your stuff is going to, even when you're piecing or when you're doing, it can start coming unsewn, and it's real frustrating. So this avoids that. So now I can come over to my table here, and I can trim these off. 1/4 inch mark on your ruler right on that seam that you just sewn. And then I take my scissors, and I know this is stupid because I don't want to cut that little twisted part, and I just cut my little corners off. Sometimes it works better than others. Okay, come back here and I'll do it on this side. So now you've got a bias bind. It's pieced by on the bias, and then I come and I finger press this before I take it to the iron. Okay, so I'm going to press it open, and I just kind of lightly, you know, I'm not really tugging, I'm just pushing, and I just press it open because it makes it easier when I take it to the iron. I don't have to do that with the hot iron. I do it now. So I'm going to trim these others, and then we'll be ready to move to the ironing board, and I'll show you how we do that next. Okay, so here we are. First thing you want to do is press those seams that, you know, I finger pressed them while I was at my machine. And you can tell I didn't do all 5, I just did 3, but that's okay. I'm just want to show you how to, next thing you do when you make a binding is now you've got to take all this and you've got to fold this in half. And you're just going to do that for the entire length of your binding. So again, don't be in a hurry because you really want to match those raw edges. And that's basically how you make a binding for a quilt. Okay. So there's all kinds of ways you can store your bindings and stuff, and we even sell a couple of gadgets. Like on this one, you could put your end through here, and then you can just wrap it all the way around, and then you just have to undo it while you're sewing. That's one way. We also sell this little gadget, and you kind of just do the same thing. It's entirely up to you. But what I like to do is I took a paper towel, the center core of the paper towel, and I cut it in half so I can get two of these out of one paper towel. And the reason I like to pull it off of this, and I always mark it, so like I know what what quilt this is. It's my Cafe beginner quilt, because sometimes I like to make my binding for my quilt as soon as I finish my quilt top, and then I'll have all my quilts lined up to do my quilting. So I did this last month or whatever, but on my cute little thread holder I have over here, this is why I decided to do this here at the office at work. I can put this right here, and I can just pull it off as I need it. It works fantastic. You can just leave it in a bunch, but a lot of times it falls on the floor or whatever. You can use one of these.
Notice.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and start attaching the binding to the quilt. And some people like to use their walking foot. Remember, we used that walking foot to do our quilting. I feel comfortable not using that, putting on the binding, and you'll be, because this is a pretty thin batting when you really look at this compared to other battings that get a little bit thicker. If I had a thicker batting, that's probably what I would do. I would probably put my walking foot on. But the reason I like to use this foot is that I can set my machine on my 1/4 inch stitch. So let me get there. Oh, I think I went too far. I did right here. Here it is. I didn't count. Okay, and I can adjust my width. So I know I like my width to be over. And I'm going to adjust my stitch length. And I sew it when it's at 2, but for a binding I do it, because I'm going through the quilt, I go up for 2.1. So that's set. The other thing I like to do, like I know my corners they're not quilted all the way to the edge. So I'm gonna go ahead and put a straight pin in each corner. Just because I don't want that to come away from the back of my quilt, because I've had that happen before, and you'll decide what you like to do and what you don't like to do, but I just do it as a precaution. There is one other thing that we should probably talk about. Sometimes you make a quilt that's meant to hang on the wall, like a wall quilt. which this quilt could be a nice wall quilt if you want to hang it on the wall. And if you want to do that, we put like a hanging sleeve on. So I would try and find, yeah, that's on there. Yeah, it's just the same fabric, yeah. And I would, you can kind of see what I've done here. I go around like 5 1/4 inches, and I fold it in half, and then I sew it across the top, and you can see it doesn't meet right at the edge, but then these are what we use to hang the quilts on the wall here, and it goes all the way in, and it'll come out over here. And I like to use, if I have it, scraps of the same backing fabric, because it looks really nice. And if you don't want to use it as a wall quilt, you've still got the same, you know, and it's on the back of your quilt, no big deal. But if you're going to do a sleeve, you can sew them all on by hand, but that's a lot of work. So I sew it in the top, I'll sew it across the top, and then the part that's, you know, the other edge, I do hand stitch that down, because you can't sew through it, because otherwise that seam will show on the front of your quilt. But we're not going to do a hanging sleeve on this one. So I can start anywhere I want. I usually don't like to start in the top or the bottom. I usually start on a side, okay? And I don't need this for this. So I've got a long thread just to get it out of the way. And this is going to look smaller than your binding, because remember I cut mine at 2 1/4. So I'm just going to start it here. And I put 1 pin in there just to get me going. Okay, so I'm going to come here, get it under there, and I am going to back stitch on this. I don't do a lot of back stitching in quilting, but on this I do. So I'm just going to do a couple stitches in the backwards direction. Okay, and I can take that pin out now. Okay, and I'm just going to go, and I'm not going to sew too fast. And I'm just going to sew until I come to the corner, and I'm going to walk you through this whole process, okay? So, and you're just lining up your binding, your raw edge, because your fold is over here. So that's you're aligning your raw edges of your quilt with the raw edge of that binding that you folded over and ironed. And we've told you this before, but everybody does binding different. They find a method that works for them. I like the way my bindings come out, and this is not how I learned, but it's how I switched to, because I think it's easier and I get a better looking binding. So that's what I'm going to teach you. There's always other videos out there that are showing you their way, people, and I recommend that you look at other videos and look at other ways that people do it. So I'm going to take this pin that's in my corner here, and I'm going to move it, and I'm going to pin it just 1/4 inch from my edge that I'm coming to. And I always eyeball that, because that's where I want to stop sewing, okay? So I've got my pin in place. I'm going to keep sewing until I come to that pin right there. I'm going to back stitch, and I cut my thread. Okay. This is where I stopped sewing, so I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to my goal is to get a 45-degree angle that runs right through that corner. And you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So I'm just flipping it over, and then I'm going to come back, and I'm matching that up. And again, I'm going to stick a tiny pin right there. And now I'm ready to put it back under my sewing machine. So I'm going to back stitch, and I don't sew all the way to the edge, but I want to sew past where that last seam is. So I've got my reverse going. Okay, and I passed that seam, so now I can go forward again. And if you go all the way to the edge, it's not going to kill you. But and I'm going to stop sewing this, because I want to show you what you're wanting to do when you flip it over, and why I like to do that. So I can take these pins out. So I'm clipping all these little threads off. And some people do that as they go, but I like, you know, when they're doing their handwork or whatever. But I don't know, I just like to make it clean as I go. Okay, so once you get it all sewn on, I want to just show you how this corner is going to turn out. You come to the back and you flip this to the front, and you want to just cover that seam, and then you pin it. But I want to show you what happens when you get to this corner and how nicely it's going to turn out. We've got all kinds of stray threads on this. Okay, so I'm tucking this in, and you can see, so I'm going to put a pin here in this corner, and then I'm going to come to the other side, and it makes a nice little, and you fold it over, and you have a really nice mitered corner. You could see it there, and you could see it on the front. And I don't like the way that looks, so I'm going to smooth it out some more from this side. And part of it is the design of the fabric. That's what it was. It was laying down flat. I just didn't like the way it looked, but I know I've got it done right. Okay. And so this is basically the way you want your corners to look. I don't know how a beginner's corner, look how nice that is. So that gives it, and this is a mitered, that's what I'm talking about when I say mitered. But, and I come back and I hand sew it or whatever, but that's the goal that you're going to want to achieve. And it may take some practice. I've had friends that before they did it on a real quilt, they just got a square piece of batting and they practiced their corners over and over again. When I come to I am on my last side. I just finished the last corner, and I'm coming up to this part where we started. So I am leaving an opening. I'm going to stop sewing. I pinned it maybe a foot. You know, you don't want to not have enough. That might be too big. In fact, let's just move it up a little closer. But and that's again. So I'm going to come to that pin, and I'm going to stop, and I'm going to back stitch again. Okay. So, because we've got to join these, and this is, hopefully I'm going to be able to explain that to you. So let's see. Okay. Okay, and I'm again going to...
Are you going to join them over there, over here?
I'll do it right here in front of me. Okay, so I always, again, I trim my little... When my machine cuts it, it leaves these little tails on the back, and I always like to get rid of those, and we could do that later, I guess. Okay, so again, you want to do a joining of these where you've got a mitered join. Okay, so I've got excess. This shows you how much extra we have. So I'm gonna, like I said, so this is, let me give you an idea. Yeah, just over 10 inches, and that usually gives you enough, because I'm going to need my ruler out of there. My little tiny 1-inch ruler, it's yellow, and I need a pencil. Yeah, that'll work. Okay, so I use this 1-inch ruler, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put a pin like right in the middle, and that's where I'm gonna measure from. So I know that my my binding, I did 2 1/4. So when I measure this, half of that is 1 1/8, okay? So from here, this is 1 1/8, but I add another 1/8 of an inch. So I'm gonna cut from this point, going this way, I'm gonna cut, I have to add that 1/8 of an inch. So I'm cutting at 1 1/4, not 1 1/8. So I put my ruler on the 1 1/8, 1 1/4, excuse me, and I just use I have just a regular pencil here because I want this to show up, and I just mark it, And that's where I'm going to cut this piece, okay? So I'll trim that in a minute. And then I come over here on this one, and I do the same thing. I lay this out. And again, I'm going to cut it at 1 1/4. So I've got my marking here. So this one's going this way, and it's hard to see it. And the reason that I add that 1/8 of an inch, some people don't, but the way I do this, and this is the part that gets a little tricky for people, is you want to connect these. So I'm going to take the top part here, and I have to open this up and then open this side up as well. And you want to put your right sides together. So I'm going to take this, and my right sides are going to come together backwards like this. You've got to fold this in. And the reason that I want that extra 1/8 of an inch is that it tells me exactly where I'm going to match these up. That's basically my 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to pin it, and you'll see I do this. I put lots of pins because I want it to be as close to perfect as possible. And I'm going to start putting my pins in on the diagonal. And if you didn't have that extra 1/8 of an inch, you would just be matching your sides. But I like to know exactly where that 1/8 of an inch helps me. So if you don't want to add that extra 1/8 of an inch, you don't have to. And if you're going to do it that way, then you would be matching yours up like this. Raw edge to raw edge, and the same thing. And that might be easier, but that's not the way that I learned. So I'm going to go back to my 1/8. I like to see my 1/8 of an inch, and I'm going to show you why I like to see that extra 1/8 of an inch, okay? Because let me get this pinned again. And you can see I'm just, and I'll take some of these pins out because I'm going to be making a diagonal seam again. So again, by having that 1/8 of an inch, I can tell where my edges are on my fabric, and that's what I like. So I don't need that pin. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to draw a line. So this is it's kind of hard to maneuver your quilt sometimes, and this is why you need that extra, when we gave like a 10 to 11 inch extra in there. I kind of fold this so I can get this piece to lay kind of flat, okay? Because if I didn't have my extra 1/8 of an inch, I would have to feel for where this thing ends. So I can see truly now where I need to sew. Oh, that lead got super long. I don't know how that happened. Okay. And if I didn't have that extra 1/8 of an inch, like over here, I would have to, okay, well, where did my fabric end? But because I have that extra 1/8 of an inch, I know exactly where I've got that marked. So that's why I do it that way. You watch other videos and see how other people do it. And I'm going to give myself another starty here. Because on this, I like to start it here. Okay, so I know exactly where I'm going to sew. I'm going to sew right on that line. And you'll notice, excuse me, that I did not backstitch again, because I'm going to have that extra, and it's not going to come apart. So I'm going to take some of these pins out that I've already sewn through. And this one needs to kind of go this way. Okay. I'm going to sew right through that. And again, I'm going to, and then clip this off. And so I've got a tail thread there and there, but it's going to make sure that this doesn't come unsewn without doing a back stitch. So before I cut anything, I always do this and make sure, oh, look, it's going to work. It's going to fit, and I got it folded the right way in the whole thing. So then I just come in here, and sometimes it's too hard to get a real ruler in there, so I use my scissors to cut this. So I'm going to cut my little trim off here. And then I'm going to cut this little tail off. If I don't cut that off, let me show you what it looks like. You have this little extra piece. You can always cut it off here, either way. And it's just in your seam allowance, but But the other thing I'm going to do before I do that, I'm going to give it a good finger press. And I don't usually take this to the sewing machine because I can get a pretty good finger press. And I'm using kind of this, my nails or my fingers, and just getting it to lay as flat as possible. And you want to press that open, and then you're going to fold it again there. So you've got that in there. And then I always come back here and I pin this because to me it's just easier to handle. And here's where I started, so I'm gonna stick some pins in here. And this fabric in this kit is Robert Kaufman fabric, and it's tends to be a little thinner compared to other fabrics. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's just my experience. You know, it sews up really easy or whatever. So I've got this pinned, and you could tell I can still come back here and finger press that if I need to. But now I don't need this anymore. And I come back, so like here's where I ended. I am not going to back stitch. I'm just going to come back here, put my needle right in that seam, about an inch or so, and I'm going to sew over that same seam. You could, again, I'm going to line up my edge, and I'm just going to sew that together. Made it safely over that pin. I know some people panic when I sew over my pins, but you can tell I never sew over them fast. It's always a slow. And I just find that I get more accuracy when I pin things. You'll wind up doing things your own way. So, and you know, I think most teachers would tell new students not to sew over their pins. So, but talk to your parents, like your mom. Find out if she used to sew over her pins if she was a sewer. You know, it's kind of interesting. So now I can cut this one off. And our binding is now sewn on. The rest of the work on this quilt will be done by hand. So I'm going to get my needle and thread and get it ready, and I'm going to show you how I start and get. We'll walk you through that part as well. It's all sewn on the front, so I'm going to pull it over to the back side. And all you want to do is just cover up that line of stitching that we just did. Okay, I'm going to show you a corner. And you saw what I did. I kind of flipped it in and pulled that corner out. And I'm going to put a pin right there. Now, I don't go right into the corner. I go a little off to the left side of that corner. But I flip it back here, and I'm liking the way it looks. So again, I've got some threads that I don't want poking out, so I'm going to do a little bit of trimming. And that's just me. You don't, you know. I don't want anybody pulling a loose thread on a quilt, so that's kind of what I do. So we got the one side pinned, so I come here and pull this out and come back in, and you just want where it's going to be, and you want to make a nice little corner. And again, I'm going to put a pin in it. And I'll just do a couple like these two, let's say, because now I want to flip it over and see if I'm happy with it. And I'm very happy with that corner. It's a nice crisp corner. You've got a tip there. So then the next thing, and I would, you know, I don't pin the whole quilt. And some people, that's the other thing. Some people don't like to use pins. They use these little clips. I never made that adjustment because I think I sew backwards when I do my handwork compared to other people. A lot of people will put this quilt in their lap and they'll sew it going this way. I don't do that. I like to work off of a table. So they would put these clips in instead of pins. Let me see if I can kind of explain why I don't like them. And I can't do that until I start sewing a little bit. Okay, so I'll do one more clip. Okay, I'm going to put this here. But let me, And I like to use thread that I think best match my binding, not my quilt. I want it to match this. And I came up with this really pretty blue. So I've got my needle here. So let's thread this. And some people do double, like they'll take this thread and they'll tie two, you know, I don't like to do that. I didn't learn that way. So, like I said, everybody does things. There's more than one way to skin a cat, and there's more than one way to make a quilt. So you find out, like I said, what's comfortable. Talk to your other people, your friends that you know that quilt or whatever, and ask questions to anybody that, you know, and you'll get there and you'll find what's comfortable for you. So we're just going to tie a knot. Okay. And I'm going to come in, and I'm going to come in my seam allowance, okay? I'm going to come in and take, and then my knot's going to be tucked away from that seam, okay? The reason I don't like this, because I've already feel like I've got to move it, because my first stitch is going to, so I would rather have a pin there, and that's just the way I do it. And I'm going to explain more reasons why I like pins rather than clips, and so I've got that there. Okay, so I've got right where my thread is, I'm going to come underneath the edge of this, and I'm going to grab it, and you can see my needle's right on the edge there. You see where it's at? That's ideally what you want. So I've got it pulled through, and now it's just pulled through this. So I'm going to come back down here, and then I'm going to come back over, and we've got our first stitch done. Then you come in here, and I like to give, this is why I like to do it this way. I give this a little tug, and that hole that I just came up through, I can get my needle right back in there and do another stitch. They tell you the quilting rules is to make your stitch no more than 1/4 of an inch, and it probably even smaller than that. It's up to you. That's what a judge would tell you. So I'm coming up, and you could see my stitches, nothing is showing, and that's what you really want to do. But this one's not attached yet, so I come again, and I come right under the lip of the fabric and grab a little, and I don't even have to be right on the edge. If I want, I can come over here. Look how far away I am, and it's still going to be okay for the way that I do it. So I'm going to give this a little tug with this hand, and that's where the hole is. Run it through there. Take it out. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Take it out to the, and again, you can see that hole, but when I do this, it's all gone, and you can't see anything. And that's ideally what you're trying to do, is to make it so your stitches don't show at all. And again, this is something that's going to take a lot of practice. But you'll get there. I keep hitting the camera. I'm sorry about that. I'll come this way. Okay. So you just saw that stitch that I did in the pink area. Where is it at? It's gone. Because I was able to go back in the same place where I came up at. So let's watch that again. See how you can see where that hole is? And I can do that because I give that thread a little bit of a tug. And look, it's gone. So for me, it doesn't matter. You don't want to get too far. You don't want to come up way over here. You want to stay close to that edge, but it's already sewn down. Oh, we got all kinds of... The other thing you want to do, and you could tell you don't want to come through to the other side. Oh, we got more threads that got wound up in there, whatever. And you can see I'm not poking through. Sometimes you do. So you get the feel of how thick that batting is inside your quilt. And you know that you're not. But if you feel like you're going in too deep, you can always just check on the other side to make sure you're not having stitches show on the front of your quilt. And if they're gonna show anywhere, if that happens, and as a beginner it's probably going to happen, let it show on the back of your quilt, not on the front. So I'm gonna let you watch until I get to this corner piece over here. came up, and here's my thread, and it's right where these are going to join. Okay, can you see that? It's right there is where I came up. So now I'm going to grab a little bit of that, and I'm going to come back. I'm going to take this pin out. I didn't necessarily go down into the back of my quilt, but that's okay. The ideal right here is to get that those corners to meet, and you can see I'm not in my corner, so I came up over here. I'm going to go back into my corner right there. Okay, so now I go out and sew that miter down. This is, as a beginner, you probably don't need to, but this is something I learned when I was having quilts judged in competitions and whatnot. They want those, they say, to keep for a corner to keep its true shape. If you sew it down, it'll stay that way the life of the quilt, even if you launder that quilt. Otherwise, sometimes they pull and whatever. But I'm just going to come back here and I do a stitch, and I try and get one way out here too. And again, you can't see. I'm trying to hide that as best as possible. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to poke it through to the other side. And you can see I'm not quite on that seam where I want to be. So I'm going to take my needle. I'm not going to pull it all the way out, but I'm going to maneuver it and poke it over to where I catch just that edge. And I got it. Okay. Now I have an option here of going over like this, but I didn't get as close to the edge. So what I'm going to give it another tug, and I'm going to put my needle back in right where I came up at, if I can. And then I'm going to come down, and I just need to do one more stitch back here. Get as close to the edge as I can. I did that right there. And again, I made sure that stitch is buried. And then I came back here, and I'm going right next to it, and I'm going to poke my needle through here. And for me, it doesn't matter where I'm at this point. I'm not, because what I'm going to do, I'm going to pull that. So now this thing is sewn, sewn through all thicknesses, and it's not going to budge. But back here, and again, I'm going to give it a little tug and go in where I came up at. And I'm going to get back to my edge. Right there on the edge of that. And now I go back into my, and you don't want to just catch fabric. You actually want to catch some of your binding. And I felt like I went a little bit deep that time, but I didn't poke through on the other side, so I'm okay with that. And you just keep doing this the whole way around. And if I sewed like other people, you know, because they say sometimes you can watch TV, sit on the sofa and do this, but I work off of a table. It's easier for me, and part of that is when I learned to quilt, I had just had surgery on my right wrist, and I'm right-handed, and holding like a big quilt in my lap was harder for me then, but I just feel better. I've got a table in front of me, and that's just, you may not like the way that I'm doing this, but it's what works for me. And if I had these clips in here, because I'm working and I'm giving my tug here, when I have this, it doesn't, that's why, and I pin from the side and the pins poke me. So what I usually try and do, that's why I'm totally opposite of what most people do, but I'll put my pins in so they're not sticking out past that fabric. Otherwise I wind up with scratch marks on my hands or whatever. But that's how I do. And if you don't want to pin your corners or, you know, sew those miters down, you don't have to. But that's just the way I like it, because I want my corner to stay like that forever. Because the weakest part of your quilt, especially like a bed quilt, it's the edges. Think about it. When you're in bed and you're partly laying on the blanket and you give it a tug, where do you give it a tug? Usually right from the edge. So that's another reason why you don't want to make those stitches too far apart, because this is the weakest part of your quilt right here on the edges, because it gets tugged and pulled right there. So that's just kind of common sense. And so I'm gonna continue with my handwork, and then we'll come back to you when it's all done so I can show it off. So that's it. Okay, well, I got my binding completely sewn down all the way around on the back side, and I liked how all my corners turned out. I think the only thing that I didn't go over earlier is tying that last knot. I always try and tie my knots like within the seam allowance, and it's hard to do on the last one. So I just try and hide it underneath the edge of my binding. and then when I tie, I do my knot twice or whatever, and then I like run it through the inside of the quilt to pull that thread out and then cut it so it's not going to poke out anywhere. That's just what I do. But now we have a completely finished quilt with a really pretty binding put on it. So hope you guys had fun. I had fun. And like I said, if you get confused on anything that we've done, try Googling other people and just see how other people do it. But you can always call the shop if you have specific questions, or email us, and we will try and get back with you.